Today's video is going to focus in on how you engage your audience, and this is extremely important because if you don't have an engaged audience, a nervous speaker is going to feel much worse when they're looking out at an audience that doesn't seem to care. So, how do you make sure that doesn't happen? When you want to engage your audience, there's two major things you want to do. The first is utilize non-factual sources. I mentioned those in the last video, and I'll talk a little bit more in depth about them today. And two, you want to make the audience active. So let's first start with non-factual sources. When you're using types of source material, it basically breaks down to two things, right? You have your factual sources, so facts, statistics, things that you get from Google Scholar, books, the database, all those sorts of things. And then you have your non-factual sources. These are not things that are false, right? I'm not calling them non-factual in that way. They just contrast factual material. Factual material is typically more dense, more difficult to understand. Factual material is engaging and easier to understand. Non-factual break down into this. We have our narratives, which are stories, visuals, which are visuals, things you can see obviously, testimony, which are quotes, and examples. So let's talk a little bit more about those and start with examples and narratives. So first, examples. Examples are kind of self-explanatory, right? But basically what you want to make sure you're doing in your speech is if you're going over a concept, you need something concrete that's going to illustrate what you're talking about. So let's say you're talking about common currency. The audience might understand common currency as a concept, but they may not fully get it to bring up the example of, say, a euro. And then they say, oh, okay, now I fully understand. Or let's say, for instance, you're doing a speech on catfishing. An example would be really helpful, maybe like that of Manti Te'o. For those who don't remember, this is the Notre Dame football player who had a girlfriend who supposedly had just died from leukemia after he had played a game, and then it actually turned out the girlfriend never existed. He had been chatting online for 2 years with someone who pretended to be this girl, and in fact it was not. It was a guy pretending to be the girl he thought he was dating. All right, let's talk about narratives. So narratives are basically an extended version of examples, and they're particularly good at really demonstrating a concept and also really adding an emotion, a connectedness for your audience. So for instance, if I was doing a speech, say, on bullying, I might want to use a narrative that truly demonstrates the consequences of that. I could use the story of Tyler Clemente, who was a Rutgers student who had not yet come out, and his roommate and roommate's girlfriend actually videotaped him having sex and then broadcast it. He found out about this and later jumped off a bridge and committed suicide. And this obviously is an extremely devastating story. But I think what it does very effectively is illustrate the fatal consequences of bullying. And that's a lot of what a narrative really can do. It can humanize a concept that people may not be able to connect to. Another really good example is genetic markers. This is a topic that for many in the audience you may think, well, this doesn't connect to me, or I don't care about this, or this is maybe too dense or scientific. But if I bring up the narrative of Angelina Jolie, you might be able to better connect. So for those of you who don't know, Angelina Jolie, for years, watched her mother battle breast cancer, and she ultimately succumbed to that battle. Angelina Jolie later got tested for the BRCA1 gene and found out that she was positive. That gene means that you have about a 70 to 80% chance of getting breast cancer or ovarian cancer. So she made the difficult decision of having a double mastectomy before even getting diagnosed with cancer. And so this kind of story really, again, can connect an audience to something that they might not automatically connect to. Another reason narratives are really effective is because they help you learn information. So in the book Made to Stick by two professors, they're actually brothers, why you may notice that they have the same last name, they did a study looking at how narratives work with memory. So the example that they used was they had a bunch of different students listen to 10 different speeches. So they listened to 10 speeches that were 1 minute each, and in each of the speeches they contained 2 to 3 statistics, right? So 10 different students came up for a minute, presented a speech, and in each of those speeches there was 2 to 3 statistics in there. Now, one of the speeches of the 10 had a story in it. When they later asked the students what they remembered, 63% of students remembered the story, only 5% remembered an individual statistic. So again, narratives are not just good at really connecting emotionally and demonstrating something, but they're also really effective, particularly for the informative speech, because your audience is going to remember the information, which of course is the goal, right? If you're informing them, you're educating them, you want them to remember this. Now let's look at testimony and visuals. So let's first start with testimony. So remember, testimony are quotes, and it breaks down to two types. The first is expert testimony, and the second is lay testimony. Expert testimony is going to be kind of what it says, basically, right? An expert in the field. So this might be a researcher, a professor, right? If you're doing maybe something on the weather, a meteorologist, someone who studies objectively the issue or field that you're talking about. When you cite them, you want to tell who they are and why they're credible, similar to how you would cite your sources. So for instance, according to Dr. Smith, a researcher from the Cato Institute. So let's say you're doing a speech on aviation, right? Your expert testimony might come from a pilot. As opposed to lay testimony, which is the exact opposite. This isn't someone who objectively studies an area, it's someone who personally experiences it, right? This typically is really good at getting sort of a feeling on how a group is working or how they relate to an issue. And again, if you cite it, you also want to make sure you cite their credibility. Now here it's not going to be, say, credentials that are professional, but how they connect to the topic. So for instance, Sarah Johnson, a current Palm Beach State student, right? If you were doing something in relationship to college students, this would be the way you would cite the credibility. So for instance, let's say you were doing your speech on student loan debt. Your expert testimony might be an economist, right? They could tell you how student loan debt is hurting the economy overall, how less people are now buying houses because once they graduate, they don't have the extra income to actually do it. Now, if you're looking for lay testimony, you could actually ask a student who could talk about how difficult it is to pay their bills and how they're struggling with the fact that, you know, they have an entry-level job that pays $30,000 a year and they have $100,000 in student loan debt and they don't know when they'll pay that off. So both of those perspectives can be really effective for a speech, but they're obviously different, right? One is more objective, one is subjective, but each gives you different ways of viewing the same thing. So when we're talking about testimony, keep in mind it can also actually be just a very dramatic quote. I have here one of my favorite Mark Twain quotes. It usually takes me more than 3 weeks to prepare a good impromptu speech. So you could also use like a famous quote or a humorous quote. This actually could be something you could try and use, for instance, as the attention getter. That's another part of testimony. Now, when we're talking about visuals, visuals are pretty much what you think they are. Anything that really can be seen. That can be a video that you use, a prop you bring in, an object. This can also, by the way, include PowerPoint and Prezi to those who have asked. Yes, you can definitely use those in your speech. Now, keep in mind, pictures can be very, very important for a speech, right? Particularly when words fail you. And pictures can motivate people to do all sorts of things and be very powerful. A more recent example that we've seen, for instance, is Syrian immigrants who are flooding into Europe, and there's been a lot of controversy about that. But it was this one image, which is of a toddler who unfortunately died in the struggle to actually get to Europe from Syria. This picture was seen all around the world, right? It went viral. And after that, a lot of people had much different reactions to what was going on with these immigrants who were coming to Europe. All of a sudden, people said, you know, we need to let them in, we need to protect them. So images can be very powerful, and that's definitely something you want to utilize in your speech. So how do you actually do that? One, you want to make sure it's not a distraction. A lot of times I'll have students who will just, you know, pick a random image and kind of put it in their PowerPoint. You need to ask yourself, does this aid my presentation? If the answer is yes, then definitely use it. However, I have students who, for instance, I have, you know, Grumpy Cat here, who will just pick random cat pictures or any other meme that pops up and utilize it. So again, the CRAP test kind of comes into play, particularly with the R, right? Relevancy. Is this truly connected to the presentation, and is this appropriate for the situation? For an academic presentation and informative speech in a college setting, right, something that doesn't relate and is not really professional is not something that you should use. So keep that in mind. No grumpy cats. Now, can you use PowerPoint? Yes, you definitely can. You can use Prezi as well. Those can be great presentation aids when used properly, and in class we'll be talking a little bit more about how to utilize that. But one thing I want to warn you with is a lot of times students will put their entire presentation on there and read word for word. Please do not be that student. All right, some other things to consider with visuals. So, a good speech, like for instance, Amy Cuddy's TED Talk, will have a majority of visuals, but not just visuals. They'll have all of the things. So she had a chart, right? She also had pictures, but in addition to the other non-factual sources, she used herself as an example, and she also told a story, right, about how she struggled with her confidence and what happened to her. And she also pinpointed people that we're familiar with. So using examples, using narratives, using testimony, right? She quoted experts and visuals. She had all of those things. So that's really helpful in what makes a speech engaging. Now, the other thing you want to keep in mind to really engage your speech is to have an audience get involved. So a passive audience, which is an audience that's not doing anything, they're just sitting there and listening, is a bored audience. So again, going back to the rhetorical situation, right, you need to think of your purpose, which is to inform, and the way to do that effectively is to reach out to your audience. You want to make this a dialogue, not a monologue. It should be somewhat of a back and forth. In some place in the speech, you need to involve the audience. That will be required. So keep in mind, if your purpose is to inform, you need to think about how to be a good educator. So considering people's learning styles. We have auditory, right, so sound. Obviously the voice, your speech itself will of course cover that. Visual, and we talked about that as a non-factual, but the last one is tactile or kinesthetic, getting your audience to do something. So let's talk about how you can actually do that. First, and this is a pretty obvious one and a really easy one that you'll see many speakers do, ask the audience a question. That's an easy one. Now, where a lot of speakers fail is sometimes they're not very specific with their questions, or they're not committed to what they're asking. That's definitely a problem, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Another thing you can do that's similar is you can poll your audience. So ask your audience to raise your hand. That's usually a little bit easier because it asks for less of a commitment level for your audience. They don't have to say anything. They can just raise their hand or not raise their hand. But let's talk about asking questions. So be specific. The reason I'm saying this is because sometimes you'll have speakers who will say, okay, well, how do you guys feel about that? What do you think? And that's an extremely vague question. You have to think on speech day, everyone else is going to be just as nervous as you. And if they really don't know what you're asking of them, plus they're nervous, you're really not going to get a response. So instead of asking, how do you feel? Maybe ask something like, most people disagree with this. Do you disagree with whatever the statement is? Or, give them a yes or no question, something that's specific, because if you ask something vague, you're going to get this response, and you will not have an effective way of asking the audience. Next thing, be committed. A lot of times I have students who will ask questions. Let's say it is a specific question, but you ask it and then you hear crickets. That can happen. I can tell you, as someone who stands in front of students all the time, I will ask a question and people will just not say anything at all. If that does happen, don't move on too quickly. I'll have students all the time who'll be like, oh, how do you feel about that? Okay, da-da-da-da-da, and they'll just move on. First, give your audience a second to actually answer. And second, if they don't answer, if you get silent, don't panic. Ask the question again, or maybe answer it yourself. Well, I know I feel da-da-da-da-da, so what do you guys think? And again, the whole you think is obviously a vague one, but answer it and then ask it to the audience. Another thing that you can think about is encouraging interaction. So there's a couple of different ways you can do this. One is get your audience to do something physical, right? The longer they sit there and don't do anything, the more boring the speech becomes. I had a student who did a speech on CrossFit, and he actually got them up, not with weights of course like this, but he got them up to actually do something, do a couple of real quick moves. You can also call out specific listeners, right? So maybe you could say, just the other day I was talking to John and he said that, he tried a CrossFit class and actually really liked it. So specific people that you can reference. Another thing, you can ask for a volunteer. So bring someone up to do something, to demonstrate something, whatever it is. So maybe instead of having the whole class do the CrossFit moves, you could bring someone up individually. One thing though to keep in mind, especially for this particular situation, since you have a bunch of nervous speakers in the room, ask the person ahead of time just to kind of give them a heads up, like, hey, is it okay if I ask you to come up? Because otherwise you might get into a situation where they aren't comfortable and then it becomes awkward. So really kind of you're volunteering them in a way. So just give them a heads up and then you can bring them up to do something. So let me give you an example of how you can utilize this in your speech. Let's say you have this statistic. You're doing a speech on tattoos and you have that in the U.S. more women than men are tattooed, which is actually true, and I found this to be very interesting. However, if you're just presenting this and then kind of moving on, that's kind of boring, right? You need to think of ways that you can take the information in your speech and make it engaging for your audience. So I could take this statistic and turn it into a question. Who do you think has more tattoos, men or women, right? And notice this question is specific. The audience knows they really only have two answers. They can either say men or they can say women, instead of maybe asking them, how do you feel about tattoos? So another thing you can do is turn it into an activity. So you could maybe ask for someone to show you their tattoo, right? So just they could pull up their sleeve and show it to you. Obviously no tattoos in places that we can't see. And lastly, you could call out a listener, right? So I know Sarah has a pretty tattoo, and that isn't unusual since more women than men have tattoos. In fact, right, so again, all of these different things that you could do as options lead into this statistic. And that's really what you want to think of this speech as. When we think of the factual material, that's important to really anchor this speech. You need this kind of material to add development. The non-factuals and the engagement of the audience really help to keep the speech alive, to keep it interesting, to keep it going. And you want to mend those two things together. You can't have one without the other. Now, another thing we need to talk about is the outline. I know I talked about this in the last video, but just to kind of review, as you're going through the process, you want to make sure you're using your material, both the factual, the non-factual, and the engagement, to really start working on the outline. So keep in mind, we talked about the speech framer, as your guide, right? You've already filled this part out and hopefully you've filled out the rest of it. You want to utilize this to then start you on the outlining process. So once you've finished the speech framer, you then want to utilize this worksheet here, which I'll talk about in a second. So remember, the speech framer breaks down the points that I have here, the 1, the 2, the 3, that is your preview. These are going to work as the points that are then going to function as your body. So now you know, okay, well, this is going to be my first body paragraph, this is going to be my second body paragraph, this is going to be my third body paragraph. So this is where you start the development process. The supporting evidence is what we talked about in the last video, right? The factual material. Additional material, right? This is basically paraphrasing what you say, adding some, other things that you want to say about it. And then, of course, the non-factual is what we've just discovered here. And, of course, this also could be a way to engage your audience as well. The next thing, once you finish that process, is you want to utilize this worksheet. This is on my faculty page, but I'm also emailing it to you. And this is a really great resource because in green, I tell you exactly what you need to do. I mean, I've really broken it down for you as easily as I possibly could. So for your first point, right, your supporting evidence, your in-depth analysis, your non-factual source. Now keep in mind, like I say up here, you don't have to follow this format exactly. It's really something to keep as a guide. So for instance, you might have supporting evidence, in-depth analysis, and then maybe you have another piece of supporting evidence. that's perfectly fine. Maybe you don't have a non-factual, or maybe you don't have a place to engage your audience, but you do want to make sure you're utilizing this. Now, you may not want to use this outline format for what you're going to present to the audience, right? You may want a more abbreviated version for the speech itself. That's perfectly fine, but this you do have to turn into me, because again, I need to know what you're going to be saying, what you're planning on doing, so I can grade you on that, because sometimes what you plan on doing doesn't always happen in your speech, and I want to give you credit for what you were actually deciding to do. Okay, so that is it. What you want to focus on now is homework. So for homework, a couple of things you need to do. One, answer this question, and this question. And the last thing you need to do, and this is the most important one, this is the one that if you don't finish this, I'm not going to give you credit, you need to type and finish the introduction and the first 2 points of your speech. So it must be typed. You don't have to bring in a printed copy. It can be a digital copy. That's fine, like on a laptop or tablet. You must have sources, and the intro must be fully completed. So keep that in mind, and we will start looking at outlines next class.